him a little button, Keith. How tough can it be? Fred Rentschler was born 20 miles south of Dayton, Ohio, in Hamilton. His dad was successful. He was the president of a large company that made steam and diesel engines. Fred grew up in a manufacturing company, in a manufacturing family. After going to Princeton University, he came home and was going to work with mom and dad at home. He didn't just want to become the front office son, he wanted to become very knowledgeable in the product. So he became an apprentice machinist and worked his way up to master machinist. Along the way, got the nickname Horsepower. He then went to the sand casting foundry, worked his way up from a sand molder to a master sand molder. He learned the business from the ground up, and not just the technical, but the business of making a business successful, the processes you needed to do, the logistics. This would be his training ground. I'm not sure he appreciated it for the future. In 1910, his dad had a new idea. Dads always have new ideas. There was this newfangled contraption called the automobile. Everybody was making automobiles. He wanted to make a new automobile company. So his dad began the Republic Motor Car Company. Fred was made secretary treasurer of that little corporation. I've seen some letters with Fred's signature on it for customer questions about this newfangled automobile. They only sold between 200 and 400. No existing examples are still around. But there is an interesting newspaper story. Fred and his brother Gordon took their new Republic Auto Company up to Dayton because they were friends with this other brothers that were pretty into the aerospace business, the Wright brothers. And during some banter, I can imagine, I'm not saying Fred had beers, but during some banter, they had a race. So it was the Republic Motor Car Company against the Wright Flyer. The newspaper says that for the first part of the race, they were neck and neck. And then, when the end of the race was coming, Orville dipped his wings, went ahead, and won the race by 20 seconds. Probably not the best thing from a marketing point of view to have your car lose to an automobile. By 1914, they were no longer in the public automobile business. Okay. What I've chosen to do during this talk, when I talk about an engine, I want to explain a little bit about what I mean. I'm guessing that all of you aren't aerospace engineers. And for those who are Pratt Whitney, I'm sorry, there's not enough detail. For those who aren't, I apologize for too much detail. Also, during the talk, there are things happening around the Pratt Whitney story that are going to influence the Pratt Whitney story. I picked a couple of those, and I wanted to share them with you. Nicholas Otto, 1876, was credited with being the first person to develop an engine using compressed gas and a 4-cycle motor engine. We know today very, very clearly as the same type of auto cycle that you're using in your car that you probably came here today with. Intake, now I get the wrong button. Look, I was going to be that tough. Okay. Yeah. Where am I? Intake. Yeah. Intake, compression, add gas, power, and exhaust. So by the time aircrafts, the Wright brothers wanted an engine, not only were the automakers not that advanced in making engines, but they wanted nothing to do with this new crazy technology. Most of the people were going to die anyway. No one's going to make them an engine. So the early engine manufacturers had to make their own engines. And they were water-cooled, 4-cycle, which looks just like this. At the top, a little grainy photo, the Wright brothers. This is their second design engine. They're now sitting upright in the flyer. The museum has engine number 16 of this design, so you could come and take a look at it. And during the 100th anniversary of the first flight, they actually took the engine out of the case and ran it. So it's one of the few Wright brothers early engines that we believe still flies. Down the bottom is one of my favorite new guys, Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis is known as an engine guy. His engine fame is going to have him become a member of a team trying to make an airplane independent of the Wright brothers. That team's going to be led by Alexander Graham Bell. And their 5th design is going to be called the Curtis Pusher, which Glenn Curtis is sitting in right now. How good an engine man was he? In 1907, he built a 260 cubic inch engine, 8-cylinder V8, air-cooled for a motorcycle. And in 1907, he held the world speed record of 137 miles an hour in a motorcycle. A record that stood until 1930. Now, it wasn't without a little problems. One of the reasons that you'll always see him with a mustache is he had an accident and there's a scar in his upper lip. But still held a record. What a fantastic guy. But this is the type of environment that's going on. U.S. enters World War II in 1917. Fred becomes a 2nd lieutenant, and because of his knowledge of engines from his dad, he is assigned by the Army Signal Corps to the Wright-Martin plant in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The U.S. is not making our own engines for that time, so they are under licensee to make this engine, the Hispano-Sousa engine, considered one of the world's best. They make about just 5,700 of them or so, and they're also making some airplanes. World War I ends. There's no more business for the Wright-Martin company, so they were sold, and $3 million, however, was held aside by the president to come up with a new project. So he asked Fred Rentschler to stay, become the VP and general manager, and find me a product, find me an organization, find me a location for a new plant. Ooh, that's gonna help Fred in the future. So he gets an organization, he takes some people from the Wright-Martin Company, he finds a plant also in New Jersey, and he forms the Wright Aeronautical Company. The Wright Aeronautical Company, his first product, he's going to make, under license again, 2 models of a Hispano-Sousa, but he also has a dream of making his own water-cooled engine design, and then maybe this newfangled air-cooled engine design. Let's step back what's happening in the world. World War I is over. The major participants meet in Washington, 1922. To prevent a future arms race, they agree not to build new battleships or new battle wagons. However, they do allow in-process battleships to be converted to aircraft carriers. And that's what the United States wants to do. This is our first aircraft carrier. Can you imagine where they stopped production on the battleship and added the flight deck? But now, Admiral Moffett is made the Air Marshal for the Navy, and he has a problem. He needs hundreds of aircraft carrier planes. That deck is only 500 feet long, so they have to be quick on their feet, good rate of climb, very maneuverable. Admiral Moffett, from his very early days, is a real proponent of not the liquid-cooled automobile engines, heavy, clunky hoses, water, radiator, but of the new air-cooled engines. At the time, the best air-cooled engine manufacturer in the United States, the gentleman named Charles Lawrence Aviation. He is considered the father of the air-cooled radial engine, and he has one that's 200 horsepower. 9-cylinder, looks like this. The Navy likes it. The Navy wants to buy it. The Navy, however, goes to see Charles Lawrence's manufacturing facility. Horrible. They're in New York City. They buy parts from everybody. The parts all come to these rooms. There's no organization. It's kind of controlled chaos, says the Navy. we really think you need to go and get some help, Mr. Lawrence. And they convince Charles Lawrence to go to the Wright Aeronautical Company and Fred Rentschler. Fred and his team take a look at Charles Lawrence's facility and agrees completely. He wants no part of it. There's no way we can make this better. Admiral Moffett, however, gives him a call and says, we gotta meet. Mr. Rentschler, we're the Navy. Not a lot of customers are buying these new airplanes and engines, and we really like air-cooled engines. We would really like you to consider buying Lawrence Aviation. Oh, let me give you another inducement. We're never buying another water-cooled engine again. Oh, now that you explain it to me that way, I think air-cooled engines look pretty cool. So they buy Lawrence Aviation, move all of their parts and technology into their plant, and begin the very excellent, quite frankly, development of air-cooled engines at the Wright Aeronautical Company. You might remember that the engine that powered the Spirit of St. Louis, 1927, Charles Lindbergh over the Atlantic, is the J5 Whirlwind engine made by Wright Aeronautical. During this whole time period, Fred Rentschler is having difficulty with his board of directors, bankers, finance people, insurance guys, who are not appreciating the technology needed to keep this airplane engines going. The difficulty of making these things and what needed to be made. Fred eventually becomes disenchanted with the hierarchy of Wright Aeronautical, quits. I've mentioned air-cooled radial engines. It wasn't obvious to me how they work. This is the 30-second primer on how they work. You see the same pistons, cylinders, inlet and exhaust valves that you're more familiar with on a car, only they're in a different arrangement. They're in a radial arrangement, star-like arrangement. The connecting rods are connected to a crankshaft in the center, which is offset. Opposite that are some large counterweights to offset some vibration. And at least on the early engines, the end of the crankshaft is where you bolt on the propeller. Simple in concept, the devil's in the details. There's a young designer, brilliant guy. He's made about a dozen planes. His name is Chance Vaught. He and Fred Rentschler become friends through Wright Aeronautical. And when Fred is out there thinking about what do I do next, I've just quit my job, he goes to Chance Vaught and asks for his advice. Hey, what do you think? Is there really a market for this new high-performance air-cooled engine? Chance Vaught is very, very supportive. And in fact, he says, you know, I'm doing a new design on my Corsair. And if I had an engine that could generate more than 400 horsepower, but it's got to underline weigh less than 650 pounds, I could make an airplane that the Navy would be proud of and would be the best in the world. That conversation became the requirements for the Wasp engine. Fred's got a dream. Fred thinks he has a team. Unlike his Wright Aeronautical days, he's got no money. So now he goes home to Dad, George, who in the Dayton area, Hamilton area, he says, I have a buddy CEO of another company, Niles, Beaumont and Pond, the largest machine tool maker in the world. He goes to them, Fred goes to them, makes a very quick presentation, and the CEO of Niles Beaumont says, you know, we have a subsidiary that has surplus funds because of the great fortune of making the product during World War I. They have unused factory space, and quite frankly, business is kind of slow. Why don't you go to Hartford, Connecticut, and talk to the president of the Pratt Whitney Company and ask them for money for your proposal. Fred does it, and in July 1925, the deal is sealed. They'll give you Fred Rentschler $250,000, some factory floor space, and 50% of the stock in this new company. And if you get that new Navy contract that's coming up in 1926, it's only about 12 months out, we'll give you another $1 million. And we'll let you, we're gonna call your part of the company the Pratt Whitney Aircraft Company. Fred is on his way.